Hello, so today's lesson is 2.10 dividing decimals. We're going to look at all three types of division with decimals. The first up is decimal by a whole number. So this is where 8, our divisor, is dividing into 6.9. Our second style is where we have a whole number, 15, dividing by a decimal divisor, 4.2. And our last style is where we have decimals both as our dividend and as our divisor. So here we're going to have 0.25 divided by 3.8. It's really important that when you look at the symbols, you're able to put the numbers in the correct location for long division. So the first number goes inside the house and the second number goes outside. We have key words in this lesson. Dividend and divisor are the positions where we put the numbers in the long division. Remember, your divisor is going outside the long division symbol. Quotient is the answer, and remainders, any leftovers. We'll see today that when we're doing decimal division, we're not going to be using remainders. But today we're going to be possibly rounding decimals and looking for terminating decimals. So rounded decimals are decimals that go on, and at some point we need to stop dividing and round the decimal, whereas terminating decimals do have a definite end, and we don't have to round those ones. Our first style of division is where we have a whole number divisor dividing into a decimal, or maybe even into another whole number where we're going to create a decimal. So for number 1, we're going to divide 2.68 into 4 pieces. Because we have a decimal in our dividend, we're going to put that decimal location in our quotient. But when we're doing the division, we don't need to look at the decimal at all. In fact, we can ignore it. 4 does not go into 2, it goes in 0 times. So because I'm placing a 0 there to hold the 1's place, I can either move on to make 26, or I can multiply it. 0 times 4 is 0, subtract, get 2, and then bring down the 6 so that I can continue to divide. 4 goes into 26 6 times. 6 times 4 is 24. And we're going to subtract. 6 minus 4 is 2. And after subtraction, we're going to bring down this 8, and we're going to repeat the process again. This time 4 is going into 28, and 4 goes into 28 7 times. 7 times 4 is 28. What we achieve here is a 0 remainder, which is what we want with decimals. So we have a terminating decimal. 2.68 divided by 4 equals 0.67. For number 2, it looks like we just have whole numbers, but we'll quickly see that we can add a decimal point. Now 35 doesn't go into 6, but 35 does go into 63 only one time. 1 times 35 is 35, and we're going to subtract and see our remainder. 3 minus 5 requires borrowing. 13 minus 5 is 8, and 5 minus 3 is 2. At this point, we have a remainder of 28, but because we're dividing decimals, we are going to keep dividing, and we're going to add in the decimal. Now, 63 has an invisible decimal right at this point. So we can extend our quotient bar, put the decimal in line, and add a 0 so that we can bring that 0 down and keep dividing. 35 into 280. This can take some side work, so you can try different numbers. But 35 times 8 equals 280. 8 times 5 is 40, and 8 times 3 is 24, plus 4 is 28. So our answer here is 8, and we have done the multiplication on the side, so we receive 280 there, and we subtract and we get our 0 remainder. So 63 divided by 35 is equal to 1.8. Remember, sometimes you have to create the decimal and add zeros in order to keep dividing so that your decimal will terminate. I'm going to do a few select questions from exercise 2.10a. We're going to solve these equations, and if we need to, we're going to round to the nearest thousandth. That's quite far out on our decimal side, so if we look at our decimal place, we have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, so we would actually have to go to 4 decimal places. I'm going to put DP for decimal places so that we could round to the thousandths place. It's not very common, but sometimes we need to be prepared to keep adding zeros and then round our answer. Let's see what happens when we divide 62.5 divided by 5. 5 is our divisor. 62.5 is our dividend. We line our decimal up in our quotient and we begin to long divide. 5 goes into 6 once. 1 times 5 is 5, and we subtract 6 minus 5 is equal to 1. After subtraction, we bring down. We can bring down the 2 here, and we repeat the process. 5 goes into 12 2 times. 2 times 5 is 10, and we subtract. 12 minus 10 is 2, and now we bring down the 5. We repeat the process once more. 5 goes into 25 5 times. 5 times 5 is 25. So we subtract and we're left with a 0 remainder. So this decimal terminates. 62.5 divided by 5 equals 12.5. For number 6, we have 44.4 divided by 8. 8 is our divisor, and 44.4 is our dividend. As we saw in number 5, we're going to pop that decimal up in the quotient, and then we'll begin to long divide. 8 doesn't go into 4, but 8 does go into 44 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40, and we subtract 44 minus 40 is equal to 4. Now we bring down the next 4, and we repeat the process. 8 goes into 44 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40, and we subtract. 44 minus 40 is equal to 4, and our decimal has not yet terminated, so we're going to start to add zeros to see if we can have the decimal terminate or if we need to round later. So I'm going to add a 0 now and bring that down and repeat the process. 8 goes into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. I subtract, and now I have a 0 remainder, so my decimal has terminated. 44.4 divided by 8 is equal to 5.55. Number 7, we're dividing 2.64 divided by 4. So I'm going to write this, and I'm going to put my decimal in my quotient, very important. Now 4 does not go into 2, so this time I'm going to put the 0, but instead of multiplying 0 times 4 is 0, I'm going to go ahead and just move my eye over to 26. Remember, I'm ignoring the decimal inside the dividend. 4 goes into 26 6 times. 6 times 4 is 24. Subtract. 6 minus 4 is 2. And I bring down this 4, and I'm ready to repeat. 4 goes into 24 6 times. 6 times 4 is 24, so I'm left with the 0 remainder. 0.66 is my quotient. For number 8, I'm dividing 17.04 divided by 2. 2 is my divisor. 17.04 is my dividend. I'm going to put my decimal up there and start to long divide. 2 goes into 1, not at all. 2 goes into 17. 8 times, 8 times. 8 times 2 is 16. Subtract. 17 minus 16 is 1. bring down the 0. 2 goes into 10 5 times. 5 times 2 is 10. And I subtract and get a 0. Now I'm going to bring down the 4 and repeat the process. 2 divided into 4 goes 2 times. 2 times 2 is 4. And this decimal is a terminating decimal. We finish off in the hundredths place at 8.52 as our quotient. In the next part of our lesson, we're going to be dividing whole numbers by decimals. And the decimals that we're going to be dividing are really little decimals. They're decimals that are less than 1. So decimals that are less than 1, when we divide by them, give us an answer that is greater than the dividend, which seems a bit weird because usually with division, we're used to having a total, dividing it up and getting answers that are smaller. But this image illustrates what happens when we divide by parts that are less than 1. So we have a cake here, and this cake can be divided into 5 pieces on the back and 5 on the front, so 10 equal pieces is this cake. And if we want to further divide this cake, we divide each of these pieces again by 0.5 or half. What happens? As we divide these 10 pieces by half, so division by 0.5, we end up getting not 10 pieces, but 20 pieces. So division by something that is less than 1 will result in an answer that is greater than where you started. 10 divided by 0.5 equals 20. And so we'll see in our next group of questions that we're going to get large answers because we're dividing by decimals that are smaller than 1. In lesson 2.9, we learned about how to multiply numbers the fast way, using the shortcut method by moving decimals to the right. And we're going to use that method in essence here with this first example, because what we have is 0.007 into 35. And when we long divide, we cannot have decimals in our divisor. It won't work. So we have to get rid of that decimal, move it out, and by moving it out, what we're actually doing is multiplying. So 0.07, if we want to remove this decimal, means we have to move the decimal place 3 places to the right. And we learned in 2.9 that moving 3 places to the right is like multiplying by 1,000, because we're going to be multiplying by 3 zeros and 1. So if we're going to move our decimal place 3 places to the right for our divisor, we have to do the same for our dividend. So we're going to create the decimal after 35 and move 3 places to the right as well. So I'm going to be adding 3 zeros in here to compensate for the decimal being moved. Now this looks a little bit yucky the way that I've drawn it. So after you do that, you may want to rewrite. And it looks like a new problem, but the answer will truly be the same answer as if we took a calculator and said 35 divided by 0.07. I've rewritten it so that it just looks nicer for me. So now I begin to long divide. 7 into 35 goes 5 times. 5 times 7 is 35. And I subtract. And all I have beside are zeros. So I can bring down those zeros, and as I bring them down, well, 7 goes into 0 0 times, and 0 times 7 is 0. So I can use a fast method here, just bringing down my zeros and filling their places with zeros, because remember, you have to have all your digits lined up. So 35,000 divided by 7 is equal to 5,000. And what that actually means is that 35 divided by 0.007 is also equal to 5,000. So now let's move our decimals so that we can make these problems manageable for long division. Number 1, we have 0.7 into 518. Because we have a decimal in our divisor, we need to get rid of it by moving it out to the right 1 decimal place. And the 518 will also need to move to the right 1 decimal place, and that requires us to add a 0. At this point, you can either scribble out the 0 in front of the 7, or you can rewrite 7 into 5,180, which will give us the same answer as 518 divided by 0.7. Remember here, by moving 1 decimal place, we've in essence multiplied that 0.7 by 10, and we've also multiplied 518 by 10. So we've just changed the numbers, but the result will be the same. All right, let's long divide. 7 does not go into 5, but does go into 51 7 times. 7 times 7 is 49. And now we subtract. 51 minus 49 is 2. And now we can bring down the 8. 7 goes into 28 4 times. 4 times 7 is 28, and we subtract and get a 0. But we have another 0 to bring down. 7 goes into 0 0 times, and 0 times 7 is 0, so we can just stop there. We have met our goal. We have a 0 remainder, and our quotient is 740. So 518 divided by 0.7 is equal to 740. For number 2, we have 0.02 as our divisor and 186 as our dividend. This time we need to move 2 decimal places, 1, 2, which in essence is multiplying quickly by 100. And because we did that to the divisor, we have to do the same to the dividend, 1, 2 decimal places, and we're going to put in 2 zeros. As I said before, you may at this point want to rewrite it so that it looks nicer and more clear for yourself. So we can write it like this. And now we can divide. 2 does not go into 1, but 2 goes into 18 9 times. 9 times 2 is 18. We subtract, bring down the 6. 2 into 6 goes 3 times. 3 times 2 is 6. We subtract and we get 0. And we can see, as we saw in number 1, that we're going to be left with some zeros here. 2 goes into 0 0 times. And if I bring down another 0, 2 goes into 0 0 times again. So 186 divided by 0.02 gives us a result of 9,300. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of the exercise questions here. You can pause the video and try them and check the solutions with me if you like. So number 1, we have 0.4 into 112. So we're going to move the decimal 1 place to the right and move 112 the decimal 1 place to the right and add a 0. This time I'm just going to scratch away, and I'm going to just start to long divide as it looks. So 4 does not go into 1, but goes into 11 2 times. 2 times 4 is 8, and 11 minus 8 is 3. I bring down the 2, and I start to divide again. 4 into 32 goes 8 times. 8 times 4 is 32, and I subtract, and I get a 0. Now I bring down this 0. 4 into 0 goes 0 times, and I'm finished. So my answer here is 280. 112 divided by 0.4 is 280. And you'll see with these small decimals that we often just end up with a whole number with no decimal in our final answer. For number 2, we're dividing 2 divided by 0.4. 0.4 is our divisor, and 2 is the dividend. I'm going to move my decimal 1 place, and accordingly move my decimal 1 place and add a 0. So now it's like I have 4 into 20. Well, 20 divided by 4 is equal to 5. and 5 times 4 is 20. So for this problem, 2 divided by 0.4, our answer is 5. The last section of this lesson is dividing decimals by decimals. So here we have an example where we have a decimal in our divisor and a decimal in our dividend. We still apply the same rules that we learned in 2.10b. We still have to get rid of the decimal in the divisor in order to confidently long divide these problems. So we're going to move 2 decimal places, which in essence is multiplying by 100. And we're going to do the same thing in our dividend, 2 decimal places. And we're going to put the new decimal place there, and of course, most importantly, put it in the right location up in the quotient. So now we can rewrite if we want to. 3 into 437.4. You can have it in your dividend, or you can just put it in the right location in your quotient. That's up to you. So I'm going to divide now. 3 goes into 4 once. 1 times 3 is 3. I subtract. 4 minus 3 is 1. I bring down the 3 here, and I repeat. 3 goes into 13 4 times. 4 times 3 is 12. Subtract, get 1, and bring down the 7. 3 goes into 17 5 times. 5 times 3 is 15. We subtract, get a 2, and bring down this 4. 3 goes into 24 8 times. 8 times 3 is 24. And we get a 0 remainder, which is what we want. That means our decimal has now terminated. So when we look at 4.374 divided by 0.03, our answer is 145.8. So we can do a few more questions together. Number 1, we have 0.25 and 6.3. We're going to move 2 decimal places to the right for our divisor and 2 decimal places to the right for our dividend, adding a 0 in here. So now it looks like 25 into 630. Remember that the new decimal place is right after that 0. We start to divide. 25 into 63. This is twice. 2 times 25 is 50. And we subtract. 63 minus 50 is 13. And now we bring down a 0. Now at this point you can ask yourselves, well, how many times does 2 go into 13? But I have 25, which is kind of rounded up, would make like 30. So how many times does 3 go into 13? Just a way for you to get a ballpark guess. So you're looking at 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, around there. So we might want to just try one of those numbers on the side. So I'm going to multiply by 5 and see where I end up. 5 times 5 is 25. And 5 times 2 is 10. Plus 2 is 12. So 125 if I choose a 5. 5 times 25 is 125, so I did my scratch work, and I subtract. 130 minus 125 is 5. Now I don't have a 0 remainder, so what I need to do now is put my decimal place in my quotient, add a 0, and bring that 0 down and see if I can get this decimal to terminate. Now I repeat, 25 into 50, this time goes twice. 2 times 25 is 50, so I subtract and I have that 0 remainder. So 25.2 is the answer here for 6.3 divided by 0.25. For number 2, I have 1 decimal place to move on my divisor and therefore 1 decimal place on my dividend. So I'm going to put that decimal up in my quotient and start to divide. 9 into 3 does not go, but 9 into 36 goes perfectly 4 times. 4 times 9 is 36, and we subtract 36 minus 36 is 0. And we bring down this 9. 9 goes into 9 once. 1 times 9 is 9. We subtract and we have a 0 remainder, which is exactly what we want. So 3.69 divided by 0.9 is equal to 4.1. So our last example is 0.07. So 2 decimal places we will move and 2 decimal places in our dividend. Our new decimal will be between the 4 and the 9, so we will put that up in our quotient. Now I'm going to scratch away the decimals and look at it as 7. 7 goes into 28 4 times. 4 times 7 is 28. And we subtract, getting a 0. At this point, we bring down the 4, and now we start to divide again. But we have a problem because 7 does not go into 4. So when this happens, we need a 0. 7 goes into 4 0 times. 0 times 7 is 0. We subtract, and then we can bring down. 7 into 49 goes 7 times. 7 times 7 is 49. So this decimal will terminate. We will have a 0 remainder. So our answer here will be 40 7/10. That's the result of 2.849 divided by 0.07. In summary, when you're dividing decimals, you can have 3 styles of questions. You can divide a decimal by a whole number, you can divide a whole number by a decimal, or you can divide decimals by decimals. Remember, when you have a decimal in the divisor position, you need to move the decimal out, and the same number of places need to be moved in your dividend.